For the Select Committee on Capital Financing Investments, January 22nd, 2024. Senator Driscoll.
Excused.
Senator Furphy.
Here.
Senator Guru.
Here.
Senator Hicks.
Here.
Senator Steinmetz.
Here.
Representative Harshman.
Excused.
Representative Knapp.
Shows that he's here.
It does appear to me that he is here as well, sir.
Okay.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Storer.
Here.
Representative Walters.
Here.
Vice Chairman Nethercott.
Excused.
Thank you. Chairman Obermueller.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Driscoll here.
Thank you. That's noted.
Good morning, committee. Our agenda today is single purpose to hear about 24 LSO 0267. See if we want to sponsor that as a committee. And I invite Ian Shaw from LSO to present the bill. He'll also be presenting the flow chart related to that bill and also potential amendments to that bill. So Ian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ian Shaw from the Legislative Service Office. Holding on for Karen. Is it, we're all good? Okay, great. Good. I'm going to do a general overview of this bill. This is the third time we've dealt with it in the committee, so I think most of the committee members are well aware of what the bill's general structure is. Talk a little bit about some amendments to the bill, and I have one handout to help review kind of the overview of what this bill does. The bill deals with both the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Fund and the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund. The very first thing I want to do is admit I made a grave error. On Friday, I had Karen email everyone just what I thought was a handy flow chart that kind of shows how these two accounts will work after this, if this bill were enacted. The very first problem with that handout, and we'll put it up on the screen here as I go through it, but I want to make sure one thing is very clear. Under the box called Trust Fund, I've said that the corpus is inviolate and may be used to pay annual SPA. The exact opposite is the truth. The corpus is not inviolate and may be used to pay the annual SPA. So boy, I mean, you talk about a major error in a flow chart, that's it. That's exactly what this bill does, is get rid of the inviolate nature of those trust funds. So if you'll please make that change to your handout, and the one that is on that will display here in a minute already has that correction. But I just wanted to make that very clear that's very confusing what I did there. The corpus of the two funds will not be inviolate. So as I said, the bill 267, we're dealing with version 0.6, deals with the Wyoming Cultural Resource Trust Fund and the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Fund. Karen, if you'll go ahead and share that screen. As I go through this, I think the flow chart kind of is the easiest way to see what has been done with these two accounts. It's not a fundamental change in way that, particularly in the general day-to-day operation of these trust funds and the way grants are made. Rather, it's a change in the accounting system and the way the accounts are divided and the way the earnings are assigned between the funds. As you can see from this flow chart, we've taken both the funds and made sure that there's a trust fund where the corpus is held and that there is an income account. Now, that's not different than the way they're currently doing business. But what the bill makes clear is that the trust fund is no longer inviolate. Rather, the corpus of the trust fund can be used to satisfy, to grant obligations. And specifically, we've clearly established or reconstituted the income accounts to accept an annual SPA or a spending policy amount every year that goes from the trust fund into the income account to fund grants every year. This is a statutorily guaranteed amount, which the trust funds have not previously enjoyed. As you can see from the flow chart here, Every year, that amount is 4% for the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Fund and 3% for the Cultural Trust Fund. You might recall that last meeting, the Treasurer's Office testified to the necessarily difference in the earning power of those two accounts. And because the Cultural Trust Fund is smaller, it doesn't have as much earning power, and therefore that smaller spending policy amount each year. So every year from the trust fund, anywhere in the trust fund, its corpus, et cetera, or its earnings, you transfer the spending policy amount to the income account, and the bill makes clear that it is from the income account that grants are made. So hence you see that arrow on the right that goes down to the grants box. In addition to this, the bill gives investment authority to the Treasurer's Office to invest the trust fund. So any funds from the trust fund or the income account can be invested. Trust fund corpus amounts can be invested in equities. And as you can see, so the money goes down into that investment earnings box, and all investment earnings as currently drafted are then deposited back to the trust fund. That's just important because they are not the income account. To the extent it has earnings, those funds are not deposited to the income account, but instead are deposited back to the trust fund. So the trust fund holds everything. It holds all the earnings, all of the corpus accumulated earnings, and then every year the spending a policy amount is transferred over the income account to fund grants. It's a fairly simple system. Now there are a couple of other pots of money from which, I shouldn't say pots, but other sources of money from which grants can be funded as well. Those would be special appropriations and gifts, bequests, et cetera, that are given directly to the income account. And then consistent with our prior discussions, any amount that is not spent in one year on grants is carried over to the following year that can then be expended on grants. So that was an important part that the committee wanted earlier in both the prior meetings, to make sure that money didn't have to be spent in one year or it would be lost, rather it could be carried over. So the bill provides for that. So that's that flow chart. And again, the only most important thing on the flow chart is to change that first box under trust fund to say that the corpus is not inviolate, because that's a very important part of this bill. I'm going to summarize the 5 main elements of the bill that I kind of discussed there. One, it makes the corpuses of these 2 trust funds inviolate. That's the way we get to this endowment model. And that's been something the committee has been talking about for several years, by making those corpuses inviolate. It establishes or confirms the income accounts as the working accounts from which grants are funded. The income accounts receive an annual spending policy amount directly from the trust fund to fund those grants. Grants can also be funded then from gifts and bequests or direct appropriations from the legislature, and again, or from unspent monies from prior years. The fourth important part of the bill is that it allows the trust fund to be invested in equities. That's something that we've had in this bill from the very beginning. I think I mentioned this at the very first meeting, and it hasn't been mentioned since. I just want to make the committee aware, as you consider sponsoring this bill, that because we do give investment authority under this bill, it will take a 2/3 vote of the legislature should the committee sponsor it and it pass the legislature. Just wanted to make that clear. And then finally, it makes clear that any income generated from the funds in either of these trust funds is deposited back to the corpus of the fund, not to the income account. So I think, yes.
Could you just repeat that last point related to the 2/3 vote and why it requires that?
Sure. Yeah. The legislature has the authority to designate funds which can be invested in equities. But in order to do that, it requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature. And so because this bill contains 2 sections that allow for the investment of these funds in equities, it will require a 2/3 vote of the legislature upon final passage of the bill.
Thank you.
Certainly. Then I do have some amendments to discuss in addition, as we reviewed, but Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you wanted to if there are any questions about the bill draft, or if you want me to go page by page through the bill, I can do that.
Yeah, Ian, committee, please go ahead and ask questions as we go along if you find
We've
something.
got, Mr. Chairman, if you could just note that we have hands up in our boxes.
Oh, Hands up in the boxes. Okay. Let's see. I don't know who was first, but Representative Larson, go ahead. And then we'll go to Senator Hicks.
Thank you. Going back, if I could, Ian, back to your flow chart, I just want to make sure that that I understand correctly for as we try to explain that your box there for investment earnings does not create an investment earnings account. It just notes that that's where the investment earnings, all investment earnings collected, then will go back to the trust fund corpus. Am I correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that is exactly right. And I'm sorry if you have some suggestions, because that's very important to know that that is not a separate account.
No, it explains well. Thank you.
And Senator Hicks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to add on to Ian, I think the very first thing we need to is if we're going to sponsor this bill is the purpose. The main purpose of this bill had two functions, and number one was to allow the state treasurer's office to seek a higher rate of return on our investments. That was number one. By changing the inviolate nature of that. Number two, the establishment of the spending policy was such that based on historic returns, what we anticipate is that the investment returns will start to partially or fully inflation-proof the accounts. In other words, the spending policy of 4% will probably not result in expenditure of all those investment earnings. So those go right back into the account. So the two main purposes is to increase our return on our investment and start to inflation-proof these accounts. So those are the two fundamental reasons that we're going down this road. And then, Ian talked about more of the mechanics of how that's going to happen. But I just can't overemphasize that's why we're doing this, those two reasons. So anyway, just want to make sure that we capture that, Mr. Chairman, as we move forward with any discussion.
Thank you, Senator. Looks like we're ready to move forward, Ian.
Very good, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, do you want me to go through the bill by page, or are we satisfied with where we're at?
Unless someone on the committee wants you to do that, I don't think we do need to do that. We have all been through this bill several times. Just one more comment about the structure of it. Ian, would you describe this as basically a pure endowment model, not an endowment like an actual endowment model?
Mr. Chairman, I think this is a pure endowment model to the point that the basic reason we always wanted to move, whether you call it an endowment model or not, the most important one, this was when we were talking about permanent funds, but these statutory funds apply as well. It used to be that the treasurer's office wasn't clear from what source of money they could make payments. If there's a spending policy of, 3 or 5% annually, from what pot of money and what source of money does that have to come? And the existing language, particularly with the permanent funds, makes it confusing, and they have interpreted it reasonably so to mean that it has to come from income. And income doesn't mean all earnings. Income means things like interest and dividends. And so they've been forced to take a spending policy of 5%, or in this bill, 3 and 4%, and only source that payment from a limited source of investment opportunities. What this does is it gets rid of that structure, and it allows the treasurer's office to take any source of money. In other words, the most advantageous ones, the ones that aren't earning money for us, and they can take those losers and spend them and keep the winners. So that's the endowment model. It prevents us from any longer having to use only a limited pool of funds from which to meet our obligations. Now we're free to use any source of income, meaning that we'll use the things that aren't making us money to make those payments.
And so, So in the endowment model, in any given year, you could end up spending some of the corpus under this model. Is that correct?
That is correct. Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Okay. Any other questions? Senator Perkins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious, reading the bill, when we look at the 5-year market average to assess the assessment, why do we, starting in 25, only use 2 years, then in 26, well, no, 25, it's only 1 year, 26, 2 years, etc. What was the thinking behind that, Mr. Chairman?
Ian?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Both of these trust accounts last year received meaningful appropriations of money into their trust account, into the corpus of the fund. Consequently, if we went 5 years, if we started with these new way of accounting next year and we went 5 years back, it would actually not adequately capture the real amount of these corpus funds. It would underestimate their value. So that's why we're starting now and going forward, because as of this year is the first year they've been fully funded.
Makes
Okay.
sense. Thank you.
Anyone else? Representative Storer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question, very much in support of this and very familiar with the endowment model and how that works. I'm curious, is it fair to say that by doing this, we will allow both of these trust funds to be invested similarly? And then I have a follow-up.
Ian?
Mr. Chairman, I probably will best leave that to the Treasurer's office, but the testimony at our last meeting did indicate that because of the substantially different size of the two corpuses, one being $200 million and the other one, I'm not sure, but I think 30 million, 35 million, something like that, they will have to be invested slightly differently. Both in a way that is more advantageous than they're currently invested, but they won't necessarily be placed in the same type of investments.
Thank you, Ian. Mr.
Follow-up?
Chairman, I'll just comment that and maybe this is something to think about in the future and talk with the Treasurer's office about. While I understand, the difference in the size of the two trusts, it seems to me that they could be invested similarly and together, and that it would really just be an accounting process to know what is from the WWNRT and what's from the Cultural Trust Fund, and allow the Cultural Trust Fund to actually spin off similarly to as the WWNRT is suggested at 4%. I think that's it's certainly the way the Storer Foundation is invested with others in some cases, where again it's an accounting process that clarifies which is our funds, but we get pulled with other investors, and I think that's just something we might want to consider down the road once we get this passed, to make sure that we're doing the best we can with our investments. Thank you.
Ian, you have a follow-up comment? Or are you ready to move on?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have a follow-up comment to that one. I think that's well taken and a matter for the Treasurer's office to comment on.
Okay. We will ask them about that. I'm sure they will be weighing in here shortly.
So, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Senator?
might be able to help there. So I think you're exactly right, Representative Storer. It's an accounting problem. And that's the rationale right now is for those that have been on CapFin for a while, what we've tried to do through the investment staff, we've lagged in our accounting component within the Treasurer's office. But the testimony that we've received currently is it's the accounting side of the equation right now until we get that fully up and running within the treasurer's office. There's limitations on the accounting side that creates tremendous difficulties in aggregating those funds and both of those trusts into one. I think that's the objective. As you pointed out, as we move forward with this, we get the accounting procedures where we can start to do that in the treasurer's office. I fully anticipate that at some point in time here in the next few years that we'll be able to do that. But right now, it's the back office side of the accounting that creates some difficulty associated with the ability to aggregate these funds. So I think we'll get there. But that's the rationale for splitting them, and the spending policies back to the 30 million versus the 205 or $210 million limits what type of funds they can invest in. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Ian, on your flow chart, just relating that to the potential amendments to this bill, does the flow chart incorporate some of these amendments, but not all of these amendments, or none of them? How does this flow chart relate to the potential amendments that we?
Mr. Chairman, thanks for that question. The flow chart wouldn't be entirely accurate with all of the amendments. The treatment of the investment earnings under one of the potential amendments would change. Although I think I'll explain later that I think that amendment, although presented in the materials you have, is not something that the parties are necessarily dedicated to doing that amendment. So this would be accurate. And then the other amendments, the other amendments would not be affected, would not affect this flow chart. So they would be the flow chart would remain accurate.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Ian, I think you can continue.
Very good. Well, Mr. Chairman, then I will go through some of the amendments. Of course, after the bill was accomplished and Senator Hicks had taken a good look at it, we made some amendments. Then we passed around to the different parties. What I will do here is I'll discuss these a little bit. In some ways, I'm speaking for the Cultural Trust Fund and specifically the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund, because Mr. Budd had some comments, some meaningful comments, suggestions for the bill draft that are the genesis of these amendments. And so I don't necessarily mean to speak for him, but his points were well taken, and so I've prepared some potential amendments that will address them. And so I'll go ahead and discuss those with you. These actually are all on page 11 of your bill, if you want to take a look at that. The three that are outlined, we also sent a proposed or potential amendment sheet, and these are the three that are identified all on that page. The chairman and I were discussing earlier that when this document is converted to the PDF that you have, the line number slightly changed, so I apologize for that. They're very close, but not identical. And what I've done is I've done these amendments in context. So I've typed them in the way they will look in the new sentence, so it's a little easier to follow, even if you don't have the exact line numbers. So the first potential amendment, there was a question that in this bill draft, the bill reconstitutes the income account for the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust. There's always been an income account, and this bill doesn't really change the way it will be used. But it does, in fact, the statutory language, it kind of acts like it's being created anew. So Mr. Budd was concerned that, well, what is that? Is it clear then what happens with prior funds that were in that account? And so this amendment is intended to address that. As I've explained on page 11, we'd add the underlined language in that sentence. So it would say, the income account shall consist of those funds in the account on June 30, 24, funds credited to the account pursuant to paragraph D2 of this section, and all monies received from federal grants and other contributions. All that does is make clear that amounts that were in the fund prior to June 30th, 24 are also included in the account.
Ian, in the bill itself, it's line 4 where that happens.
Yes,
people are tracking along with the bill. It's that line 4 right after funds, the first word.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, on my draft, that's lines 5 and 6 on page 11, but it might be slightly different than that. The sentence starts, "The income account shall consist of."
Mhm. Well,
So if-
it's possible that the members have different versions of this .62 depending on when it was printed out or sent to us.
Right.
I think everybody understands the drill now. You know, there might be a line off, but that's bad. That's all. So,
Mr. Chairman,
Gary,
Mr. Chairman.
yes, Senator
But I
Roth,
think,
Representative
thank-
Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's important that for the purpose of this conversation and the motions we make, all of this is, the official version is draft verse 6.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Ian.
Very good. The second amendment on that same page is down further. And this one's a little more complicated. This is around line 12, and the sentence starts, "The income account shall not accept title to any interest in real property." When Senator Hicks and I discussed the bill, we discussed whether this was appropriate because in fact, the income account does not accept real property. And we decided that it would be better to include this language because in fact, in the language that discussed the corpus, the trust account itself, not the income account, but the trust account, there is language in there that discusses how the trust account, the corpus, can accept title to real property. So we decided it would just be, why not pin it down and make it clear that the income account cannot. Now, that still may be, the purpose there is a good one, but I talked to Mr. Patrick Fleming on the phone about this bill kind of generally. He was making some comments, and there were some concerns about that. First of all, the income account, Mr. Budd pointed out that the income account is never going to receive title to real property anyway. There is some discussion about that in the statutes, in fact, in 915-103 that talks about the board accepting property, and it would not make it appropriate for the income account to receive real property. So in other words, it's not going to happen whether it says it in statute, right here in statute anyway. Second of all, when these amounts, the way the Treasurer's Office invests some funds, particularly some profitable investments, involve real estate, some of our non-traditional funds. So the question is, does it confuse the matter when we say we can't hold any title? Well, it's not clear exactly if you receive real title to real property when you make those investments, but the point is, why confuse the matter? And so even though this amendment is presented here for you, the committee may want to carefully consider whether it's necessary or whether it might actually do more harm than good if we included it. So that's the second amendment. The third amendment is in the bottom of the page. It talks about the investment of earnings. It's around line 19. It said, "Earnings from any investments of the income account shall be credited to the trust account created by paragraph A of this section." Now we've discussed that a couple of times already today, and the fact that with this bill, earnings are invested back to the trust account and don't go to the income account. Well, Mr. Budd pointed out that some of the special projects, and maybe that's not the right word, but some of the funds that exist in the current income account for the Wildlife Trust are in fact treated separately. I think they come from a different source of money, special gifts and bequests and grants, and so they have traditionally treated them differently and even credited any income that does come from that money back to that account so that it would stay with that special pot of money. So we had a brief discussion about that. Dawn Williams of the Treasurer's Office expressed some fairly significant concern about that. She said that it would be nearly impossible without creating different accounts to do that in their system, to give special, to create these special income channels for each source of money within the income account. So there is language here at the bottom of this handout that would allow for a special accounting of that income within the income account. But, and I'll let them testify this more specifically, but I believe both Mr. Budd and Dawn Williams have agreed that maybe that language is not necessarily, and again, not to speak for Bob Budd, but I think he may be comfortable without this language and simply requiring all income to be deposited back to the trust account. So we'll let him speak to that. I have one additional amendment that is not on this page, and it came from I was preparing for this meeting and an additional careful review of this bill. If you'll turn to page 16 of the bill draft, it talks about, as we've discussed in this bill, grants are funded from an annual spending policy amount that comes from the trust fund, and it provides for a solid amount, either 3 or 4% every year to be spent on grants. But there are additional amounts that also can be spent on grants, and those additional amounts are described here on page 16. Some of them, like, we've on paragraph 2 on page 16, B2, it talks about how, well, you can also spend money on staffing. That's something that's always been in statutes. On the next page, it talks about how carryover amounts from prior years can be spent. That's all fine. The next one is previously obligated funds in the income accounts can be spent. Well, if you go back down page 16 and the very first paragraph there, number 1, or it looks like an I, it says that funds that are specifically appropriated or credited to the income account or trust account under subsections A or B of this section, unless the appropriation, contribution, grant, gift, transfer, bequest, or donation provides otherwise. I would propose changing that language in a fairly simple way, but the idea of this paragraph is to say that if you have a special appropriation, if someone specifically comes to the Wildlife Trust and says, here's $1 million and I want you to spend it on this, then that's not going to count in your annual spending amount because there's special money for it. It's already been funded. It makes sense to allow them to spend it. I don't think this paragraph is entirely, as written, accurate on that point. And I think it would help if it says, rather than saying, unless the appropriation, contribution, grant, gift, transfer, bequest provides otherwise, I think it should say, if the appropriation, contribution, grant, gift, transfer, bequest, or donation so provides. In other words, if a special appropriation or a gift or a donation provides that it's going to be spent in addition to the SPA, or it's a special appropriation, then that's what happens. And I think it makes sense to do it that way. It has the exact same meaning. I just think it's more clear. And I'm happy to go, the specific language, I'm happy if the committee wants that amendment later, I'm happy to go back through this specific language for that. And Mr. Chairman, that's everything.
Committee, does anybody have any questions about this last amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Who is
Representative Walters.
Oh, Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for Ian. You offer the word if in that sentence. What about if you changed it to when the appropriation provides otherwise? So it doesn't sound quite so uncertain.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's absolutely, that's great. I think the word when is better than if.
Anybody else have any questions about that? Okay. All right, Ian, what else do you have for us?
Mr. Chairman, unless there are other questions about the bill, I think that's everything.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I think we're ready to take some testimony about this bill. Do we have somebody representing the Treasurer's Office this morning that wants to talk to us? That's no one. Karen, have you heard anything from the Treasurer's Office?
Mr. Chairman, we have several people that have been waiting in the wings, and I'm bringing them all in right now. So you'll see the Treasurer's Office as well as representatives from both trust funds.
Good deal. Okay, well, let's hear from the Treasurer's Office then.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And committee, this is Dawn Williams, Deputy State Treasurer.
Good morning, Dawn.
Good morning. I'm joined today with Katie Smith, our CFO, and Patrick Fleming, who is our CIO, Chief Investment Officer. We have lots of things to say based on the testimony that's already occurred. We want to make a few corrections. And so I'm going to use that as my segue and ask Patrick to start us off. Thank you.
Okay, Patrick, good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Don. Patrick Fleming, CIO for Treasurer's Office. Yes, I'll go over some of the comments that were made earlier in order so I can just address a couple of the issues. One is Senator Hicks' comments of the things that we're trying to do for the bill. I just want to reiterate, how important we've been trying to do this kind of endowment type of model, which is so important to be able to give agencies or any entity that wants to spend the money to give them a runway to be able to see what they have. Also showing that you don't need the reserve accounts when you have this kind of model. One point I do want to clarify is where these funds will go. So yes, they will be in the same investments, and this will be in what we're calling the kind of total rate of return liquid bucket. And so yes, this is a much better step up towards a true endowment model. It is not yet a pure endowment model because of the nature to have liquidity. So after meeting with the board of directors and Director Budd from Cultural Trust and Wildlife Trust Funds, both of them insinuated that they felt uncomfortable that if we had all of the funds that potentially could be in investment that could be up to 12 to 15 years, that if there was a very large undetermined spend that came up that they needed, they would need to have access to those funds. So if you have an instance where you don't have multiple billions of dollars and you have a large spend, then that would really wreak havoc with your asset allocation and what you're trying to do. So because of that, what we did is we want to put them into the exact same asset classes, but this will be a liquid bucket. It's the same accounts that will be in Pool A, in reserve accounts, and et cetera. So the estimated return differential between a liquid and an illiquid bucket from last year's CMA capital market assumptions were approximately 50 basis points. So that illiquidity premium costs you about 50 bips, which is de minimis in what we're trying to do. But yes, it would still be inflation proof. That's where you get the 4%. At that time, we were estimating a 6.5% return for this bucket versus a 7 for the illiquid bucket. And then minus 2.5% inflation, that's where we get the 4% spend. So with that, yes, we're moving towards that endowment model, and this is so much better. It's a great first step. But because of the need for potential large spends, we would not be able to put them into the illiquid bucket. Now, at a later stage, if you feel that's appropriate, we could do that. But without reserve accounts and so forth, that could potentially be problematic. But just to clarify where the funds are going, what type of anticipated returns we had from last year. Now, we haven't done our asset allocation. That will be this March. So we'll find out exactly what our next 10-year assumptions will be. But that's just kind of a ballpark figure of what we're looking at, of where they would be. So that's as far as the endowment model I would like to comment and where the funds will be invested. The other comment that
Patrick, I have a
Mr. Chairman?
question for you on that. In terms of being a pure endowment, the difference is that you could, in a sense, go outside of the endowment model for a large project and invade corpus for some large spend above and beyond the spending policy. Is that what you're saying, or am I missing something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So let's just say you have, 28 million or whatever we have in the Cultural Trust Fund. It's called the denominator effect. So what happens is, let's say out of the blue, they had a 7 million spend or whatever. And so you would have 25% of your fund that would come down. So what you do is you sell across the board 25% of your assets. But in this instance, when you can't sell illiquid assets, your private equity, private credit, real estate, et cetera, all of a sudden, those assets as a percentage of the total grow exponentially. And so it's just, kind of, modern portfolio theory, economic theory that you do. You don't put illiquid assets in a investment that could potentially have a large drawdown. So for instance, the PMTF, Common School, those will be in the total rate of return illiquid because they're so large. They have reserve accounts. They're able to withstand any type of a drawdown, and any drawdown that we'd see would be de minimis. It would not be 25% of the bucket. So from that instance, it would not impact the returns.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So just in a real live situation, either one of these funds receives their annual spending policy amount of 4%. But under this model, they could draw more than that for a specific purpose. The corpus is available above and beyond the spending policy amount in these bills.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that they're able to do so, but I don't know if they need legislative approval or how they do so. I'd leave that to Don or Ian to tell me how they could potentially draw a larger amount than the designated 4% spend, because as it is now, they would only be able to get 4%.
Okay. All right, go ahead. Representative Story, you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Patrick. I guess I'm still trying to understand, where you would, the likelihood of needing to spend 7 out of the 30 million seems unlikely given the spending policy that we've set up. And so within that 30 million, it still seems, especially if you aggregate them, that you will have a variety of different investments that have different liquidity, and that could be enough to provide the liquidity that would be expected to fund the spending policy. I mean, I get that there was only 50 basis points this year in the difference, but that's also because, as we know, private equity didn't perform particularly well in the last 12 months. But in other years, there might be a considerable difference. So I'm just still trying to understand kind of what the thinking is there.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, that was, I use 7 as just an example, but that was the color that we got back from both of the committees, the board, and then Director Budd, about, kind of more of a go slow, just let's see how this works, because we have certain uncertain spending. So let's just look at, I'm just saying, the types of assets that have larger lockups. So you have hedge funds, real estate, private credit, private equity, infrastructure. Those would be just 5, for example, asset classes that you would not be able to get your funding out in a short order. They vary from anywhere from a couple years to 15 years. So if there is a need for a larger amount, if you ever did need to go over that 4% spend, then especially the Cultural Trust Fund, that would from that denominator effect, those illiquids would be a much, much larger portion. You'd go from 30-odd% maybe to 50% of your assets in a illiquid investment. And that's just not what you would normally do. So, 1, asset size, and 2, is what they had mentioned. Now, if they would like us to do that and they say, we will never need a large investment, 4% in perpetuity is great, then that is no problem whatsoever from us. But this was dictated from both of the members. And I know Director Budd's on, he could comment on it if something came up, but that was just the information that we received from the board and its members about their potential need for income.
Patrick, I just have a follow-up. I know when we originally selected this particular bill and this particular draft, the idea of being an experiment and a direct, you know, a pure endowment model. I think that was part of the thinking of this, that we wanted a bill that was an endowment model. We could, going forward, compare that to these other models and see how they work. So I'm still uncertain in my own mind about this bill as far as being an endowment model. Is it, or is it not an endowment model? And what do we need to make it such if it isn't?
Mr. Chairman, yes, a very good question. So yes, this is a pure endowment model. So if you look at the endowments and the need for spend, let's just take Harvard for an example. I don't know about this year after the issues they had, but last year, for instance, they had $560 million that came through just in donations. So they never, you know, the 30 odd billion dollars, they don't ever have a need for the spend. There's many endowments out there that have a much tighter budget. And so in a pure endowment model, you're looking at the spending needs of the institution and what they have and what they need, versus the liquidity preference. So in this instance, with our large funds, we don't have a concern with that. But anytime that you look for, you know, this pure endowment model, you also have to look at the underlying need for the various funds. So yes, it is a pure endowment model, but the asset allocation of that would vary upon the needs of the fund that is investing. So yes, it's pure endowment. The big thing is spending corpus. That's the no-brainer. And so as Senator Hicks was saying, to allow us to do that, if we could do that with all of the other funds, all of these issues that we'd have, 90% of these issues would go away. So this is a great first step, but we're also wanting to be cognizant of potential liquidity needs of the underlying funds. And if they want to go into a higher yielding, less liquid asset class, that is fine with us. We can do that in a heartbeat. But from the color and information that we received, that was not their intention at this time. Director Budd specifically said, you know, we're not even sure if this 4% is going to work for us. Let's do it now and see what happens. So this was kind of the information from what we received from them, but we will do whatever is needed.
Okay, so just a follow-up. I mean, part of the theory of doing this, taking this approach here as an example, is that there is a belief that the straight endowment model is actually a superior model for investment returns. Is that or potentially is, in theory? Do you have an opinion on that, Patrick?
Mr. Chairman, yes, and I could quantify all kinds of returns. You know, just look at the Ivy Leagues, for instance. You know, they are one of the first in the endowment model, who they typically do not need great liquidity, but when they do, they can be in trouble. And I want to tell you one anecdote on this and show you why. But their returns are typically in the like a 10-year return in, let's say, a 9 to 11 to 13%. And that just shows you how much more of a return you can get in that type of a model. So absolutely, the endowment model is superior, but you have to be cognizant of your liquidity preference. So let's use Columbia in that Ivy League endowment model. In the great financial crisis, Columbia had too many of their assets in illiquid assets. And as you know, they have a certain amount of spend that they have to spend. So yes, still they have to go through and sell assets that they have, but they didn't have any assets that were liquid. They had to sell illiquid assets at 50 cents on the dollar to fund their operations. So yes, there's an endowment model, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands that liquidity is still extremely important. So every entity that is invested in an endowment model has to go through a liquidity preference, how much you're going to spend, how much you're needing. And we're seeing this across the board. Many endowments over allocated to illiquid investments and are needing to liquidate those assets as we speak. We see these come across all the time. And they're being liquidated now, not at 50%, but 35% lower, 65 cents on the dollar from the market value that they have them marked. So yes, it's an endowment model, but you still have to be cognizant of liquidity.
Okay, thank you. Anybody? Oh, Senator Hicks, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on this issue. So the 50% basis points, but that's the money that would basically go back into the fund to inflation proof it, and then you compound that. So over a period of time, that 50 basis points will make a difference for the total amount in the corpus, which spends off more money based on the 5-year average. So it kind of defeats the purpose to do that. But the other side of it is so let's deal with the big spend request. That request is kind of operated based on the way that the trust funds have operated in the past. In other words, they just spent all of the investment earnings off of that with nothing going back towards the corpus. So that resided in the income account. So it allowed those boards the ability, because they could say, well, we're only going to spend $4 million this year. We had $6 million in there. Do that a couple of years, and then all of a sudden those boards could allocate a big spend. The very reason that we put a spending policy in there, again, is to try to inflation-proof these things, provide them an adequate amount of liquidity and money to generate income. Specifically with the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund, anything over $400,000, they have to come back to the legislature anyway. I'm just uncomfortable all of a sudden saying, well, now we need to provide it outside of the spending policy, the ability to go spend more money without further legislative authorization. And maybe Mr. Budd can address that, but I think the way we've set this up now is meets every intent of what the legislature is trying to do, is increase our investment returns and then inflation proof these accounts. Makes more sense. So I'm a little concerned about deviating now and saying, well, we're going to allow, I don't know how they would do a big spend under the current bill. And Ian, this is a specific question for you. So how would they go about and do a big spend under the current bill that exceeds the 4% spending policy? I don't see that mechanism's in the bill. So without providing some exceptions to the spending policy, how would they do that anyway?
Ian?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Senator Hicks. The bill definitely doesn't allow them to do that. And to my knowledge, there's no place on the statute that allows them to do that. The only way they could have a bigger spend is if they already have a special appropriation or a special gift, bequest, donation that would allow a bigger spend, but that money would already be there and already have to be tagged for that specific purpose.
Thank you, Ian. Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say that I agree with Senator Hicks. And if the point is that there isn't the opportunity for a big spend or the need for a big spend, then considering an investment that has a variety of different liquidity within the portfolio, to me, makes sense. And knowing that, even, that part of it may be, as described in these longer term investments that have longer illiquid characteristics, but that enough is in liquid form, mostly in the public markets, and that's allowed. I'll just say that the Storr Foundation has been operating this way for 60 years, and we're still in business. And the IRS tells us that we have to spend 5% every year. Thanks,
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, so the committee in previous meetings had asked us to reach out to the various entities to ask them about what they want spending people in this pool A. And so we're just following up with what you had asked us to do. But if you or however, if it's the individuals or whatever that say, no, you should be in the illiquid bucket, the maximum returning asset allocation that we have, that is easy for us. We don't care. All we're doing is following the committee's kind of directions of what we should do and listening to the constituents and what they were saying that potentially could come down the road.
Okay. Senator Furphy, you have your hand up. Senator Furphy. I guess his hand is up, but he's checked out. Anybody else with a follow-up? Patrick,
Mr. Chair.
follow up.
Yes, I just wanted to follow through the list of where we're going through. The other comment that was made was the allocations and considering accounting. And one, I just want to clarify from my perspective, and Katie can comment on hers as well. But after that, you appropriated more individuals, that we actually have the people who can help Katie actually do her job instead of being so shorthanded. We have never had an issue. Katie has been ready to go with this for a long time. We've been ready. There is no issue whatsoever from the accounting side. We've been, after you get appropriated the staff and allowed her to actually do her job, we're, she's ready to go. Anytime we have this going, then we're good to go. So there is no issue whatsoever from our perspective on the accounting side.
Hey,
Mr.
committee,
Chairman,
anyone else with a question? I see, let's just go to Dawn with the Treasurer's Office. Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I think Katie was trying to jump in. Appreciate that, though.
Oh, it's Katie. Oh, okay.
so sorry, Mr. Chairman. Hi, good morning, everybody, members of the committee. Again, Katie Smith, the CFO for the State Treasurer's Office. Nice to see everybody this morning. I echo Patrick. I was concerned hearing some of those comments this morning, and I am sincerely sorry. Clearly, I haven't done a good enough job explaining to you the successes and where we're at on the accounting process. We have made huge efficiencies with, the appropriations and the positions. My staff is very equipped to handle these types of situations. We have segregations, we have comminglements, we have everything under the sun that we're accounting for, and we do it successfully. Yes, we had some issues in the past, but we are through that. We are progressing and becoming more efficient each and every day. Our accounting system is still underway. As Senator Hicks had said, we're still working on that, but it's more from an efficiency standpoint. Our chart of accounts has been completely revamped and changed to handle progression, right? The whole point of that was to build an accounting system that would grow and that would establish, abilities that we haven't had in the past. And so we're there and ready to tackle those on. And now we're just, polishing, making reports and making things a little bit easier so we're not so manual and doing things, pen and paper and utilizing the systems as best as we can. So again, from an accounting perspective, we're ready. There is no holdup from our side. We can handle whatever is decided. Thank you.
Katie, I have a question for you. Do you have the amendments in front of you?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I do.
So the last one that talks about this being a difficult proposition for the Treasurer's Office. Does that still apply that this distribution of earnings to by these various categories is still a problem?
Mr. Chairman, it's not ideal. So again, we can tackle a lot of variety of different things. The way that the amendment is written and the way that I interpret it is that all earnings are going to go to the trust fund unless there is some redirection for the appropriation, contribution, or grant. And what makes that hard for us to implement is that means every time we go to distribute, if it's directed to go somewhere else, we have to change all of the tables in our system. We have to have multiple revenue budgets set up in WOLFs to maintain that constant switch if that's decided. And so for us, it's much easier to just have all of the earnings go back to the trust fund, if that's what the committee decides and the legislature approves, is to have that go to the trust fund. And then if there is a need to transfer money, those earnings that went to the trust fund into the income account for those specific purposes, that can be done later and not have to be done at that point of distribution. So that's really where the complexity comes from. Is
Okay.
it possible? Absolutely. But is it ideal? No, it's not efficient, and it's not, it's going the opposite direction in which we're trying to proceed.
Okay, Katie, yeah, stand by. I think there's some questions coming from the committee here. Senator, I'll just take them. I don't know who was first, but I'll take Senator Guru first. And we'll work through the questions here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First to you, Katie. Thank you for that, and I do want to reiterate at least from our side of the table, from my side of the vantage point, I guess would be the best place to start, to say I appreciate the fact that the Treasurer's Office has grown exponentially in its ability to handle this sort of stuff, and I know that we've worked very hard on that. I know the Treasurer's worked really hard at it, and I really appreciate it. Come a long way together in the past few years, and so I appreciate it. And I hope that, I guess, just an overall comment, you guys, as we all dive into this, not to overthink it too much. We're taking a first step here. We're starting with a couple of accounts and moving towards this endowment model. I know some of us have some issues. I know I do. But I want to try this, and I don't want to overthink it or let perfect be the enemy of good as we go through this, and make sure that, we don't want any unintended consequences, but we also don't want to make it so complicated that we don't get the body to pass it. And then all of a sudden we're stuck in neutral. So while all you smart folks do that, I'll just be kind of listening along and trying to follow along and follow your lead. But let's try to keep our eye on that one. And I think we can do good work here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Patrick or Katie, just wanted some clarification. Certainly knowing that your accounting has really improved and all of that, but I was thinking the commingling of funds, the auditors or somebody had said, no, we can't do that any longer. And so even in our October meeting, I was thinking we discussed that this model would work well for the Wildlife Trust due to the large size of its corpus, maybe not as well for the Cultural Trust due to its just close to $30 million size. And the question then I believe was asked, can we not put them together to where you'd have 230 million go out and invest, and then accounting wise you figure out whose money is what at the end of the day. And we were advised that that is not possible. And so just a little more clarification, certainly not doubting your efforts, just trying to better educate myself and more edification on how I've misunderstood that.
Patrick, you want to?
Mr. Chairman, I'll take a stab from an accounting perspective, if that's okay with you.
Okay,
And then
go
Patrick
ahead.
can chime in and fill in any blanks.
Sure.
Okay. So Representative Walters, the issue becomes if you're taking two buckets of money for two different purposes and putting it into one fund. That's not extremely ideal from an accounting perspective. It's just another layer of us having to manually separate out those funds and what each portion of those funds was earned for that purpose. So that's where that complication comes from, putting both of those funds together into one fund and then having it be invested. Now, each fund going into the same strategy, not an issue. That is something that we do currently. We have that for the permanent land funds, for instance. All the permanent land funds are invested in the same pool strategy, and we can segregate those out. We do that now. Going into even the TRR, the total rate of return strategy, the portfolio structure for that, it's going to be actually more comminglement. We're going to have more funds in one strategy opposed to all of these individual pools. So that is definitely not the issue. It's just when you're taking if you're still trying to segregate and see each fund's, like the cultural piece and the wildlife piece, and wanting to see those separately, it's just an added layer of manual process that we would have to do to separate that out if you put those together in the same fund. And that's, I believe that is what we were trying to explain in our testimony. It's just not ideal, it's not efficient.
Patrick, you have a follow-up to the comments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Looking at this, when you're looking at, what we're talking about into these various buckets, one thing that I do want to reiterate is because of, similar to what Representative Walters was saying about the commingling, we can also not sell one asset and give it to another asset group. So we can't go from one fund, PMTF, to Wildlife Resource Trust, if you will. That's what's called the in-kind transfers, which we're not allowed to do from a regulatory standpoint and accounting standpoint. So just so everyone knows that if we do move this into the illiquid bucket, this is going to take us many years to be able to put this out, because we can't take the entire private equity bucket that we have now and give these new funds, Common School is included as well, into this. We're building out this illiquid bucket, the private equity and the private credit and so forth, that was not in these accounts. And it's going to take us at least 5 years to get those allocations in. So it's not like we're going to immediately move from a 0 or 100% liquidity to 70% liquidity. This is going to take many years to do so because of accounting restrictions, or not accounting, auditing restrictions, or KPMG or what have you. That would be restrict us from doing it. McGee, Hearn and Pies, I'm referring to. I'm sorry.
Okay, Senator Hicks, you had a question.
Yeah, so first let me say my poor job of articulating the concerns that was raised by Representative Storer earlier gets back to exactly what Representative Walters was talking about. The testimony, as I understood it last time, is we were talking about just aggregating those the 200 and the 230 million and just investing that in one asset allocation starts to create complications by mixing those firms. I think you guys, that's what I was trying to articulate. I didn't do a very good job. So if my apologies to the Treasurer's Office and the accountings if it come off something other than that. So there's always a danger of a legislature trying to explain complicated issues. So anyway, but my question was the same as Representative Walters. I thought that's what I heard. Why can't we aggregate these funds and do that? So that was, so again, my apologies to the Treasurer's Office for doing such a poor job of articulating that.
Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm sorry if I'm a little slow on getting up to speed on exactly how we're doing this, but I guess my question is for Mr. Fleming. I'm still kind of trying to understand why we talk about liquid buckets and illiquid buckets when I think of taking any of these trust funds and putting them in a variety of investments that have a variety of liquidity requirements, and being able to do that such that we get the highest total rate of return. What am I missing here?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, let's use a couple examples. The need for the liquid and the illiquid bucket. So illiquid, highest rate of return, it's going to have all of those illiquid assets that I referred to. The liquid bucket, an example would be reserve accounts. So now that we have a reserve account and we have that 5-year spend that we're okay, we no longer want to have that into the state agency pool and just earning, short-term rates. So that would be a great example. You put that into an illiquid bucket, What is it? It's a reserve account. It's again, every fund you have to look at the liquidity nature of it. A reserve account is going to be spent. There's no way that you ever want to put a reserve account into an illiquid nature. So that's just an example of one of these asset classes that would move into this. Another one would be other Pool A participants. So we're talking about the two largest ones. We have many of these funds that have much smaller amounts, like 5 million or whatever. When you have that small of amount, and you're talking about, minimum allocations to get a very diverse portfolio of might be 100,000 or something, let's say, and you have a total of 5 million, there's no way that you want to have, a very large allocation just because of the size. So it really is dictated by the pure liquidity needs of each one of these different groups and what they can be invested in.
Follow-up, Representative Store?
Maybe I'll just take this offline. I'm still, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I still think of like the way I would think of, if this is the endowment model, I would take WWNRT or even the 30 million of the Cultural Trust Fund, and I would invest that in public equity, fixed income, real assets, hedge funds, opportunistic credit, private equity in a, as decided by the Treasurer's Office, right, for a balanced return. And that's just how I think about it. And obviously those have different liquidity profiles. But there would still be enough that would be liquid to fulfill the spending policy. That's the way I think about it.
All right, thank you. So from the Treasurer's Office standpoint, do you have any further comments about these bills, the amendments, the flow chart, anything that you want to instruct the committee about? Treasurer's Office is silent, so.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any other agencies, departments in the state government that want to? I don't see anybody out there from anybody else. Looks like we're ready to open up for
Mr. Chairman,
comment.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Senator Guru.
Yeah, I think we've got, Sarah Sheen and Dave Glenn, and I saw Bob Budd float in and out. I don't know. Oh, Sarah's got her hand up. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think I see Bob Budd is on the screen. Good morning.
Good morning, and I'll be happy to comment whenever you're ready.
You take it away.
Okay. A couple things that I think are important to put in context. First of all, we're very supportive of where this is going. And I think at times the comments have been interpreted as being negative or skeptical. Perhaps there's a bit of skepticism because we haven't ever done it, and it's a new way of operating. And I think that some of the questions we've raised and some of the concerns that are out there have been primarily our ability to understand, how does this look? How does it flow? The other thing is that I think a lot of the conversation relative to a big spend and things like that is actually more related to spending authority and how money flows in these types of programs. Our grants are written for 3 years. We don't know, depending on how federal funds are matched, how private funds come in, we have leverage of about $5 or $6 to every dollar we spend. So there are federal requirements that are different sometimes. Sometimes that means you have to spend the federal money first, and we come in at the end with one large payment. In other cases, we may pay as they go. Senator Hicks is very familiar with what I'm talking about. And so some of that was really more related to spending authority and the timing and how that goes. We don't have any discomfort with any way that you proceed, other than I think we do need a little time. And I think it was said very well by Senator Guru. Let's see how it works and then make those adjustments as we see how this rolls out. But we're very supportive. We think we can operate with the 4% spend. That's a less, just so you know, that's less than what we did this year. We were at about right almost at 5. We're at 4.75, but we can operate within that. The amendments that were described by Mr. Shaw were meant, and I think they addressed the issues we had. And then finally, the question on mixing of funds, we're totally okay with that. We just have to tell people, no, the interest is all credited to this account. If there is a case like we had with mitigation funds from the BLM, where that had to be segregated, we will have to come back and ask for JAC to create another account, which we did and they did, and that resolved that issue. So I think with the amendments that have been discussed, we're very comfortable and very supportive of where you're going.
Thank you very much. Anybody have questions for Mr. Budd?
So, Mr. Chairman?
Questions? Senator Hicks.
Yeah, so Bob, under the scenarios that you talked about, so if we do the 4% spend, and the board allocates that money just stays in that income account until you actually write the check. It may be 2 or 3 years down the road. So what actually ends up in the income account, the way that's structured, that amount of money just stays in there. So you still get another 4%. So let's assume you had a big spend. And I just want to make sure that I understand and you understand, and we're all in agreement that this is how it's going to work, back to your concern. So say in 2020, you obligated a $2 million large spend out of your income account. That money sits there until you actually expend it. In 2021, you had to get another $4 million. In 2022, you'd get another $4 million. So that income account is sitting there now for $10 million. But part of that's that $2 million that was originally obligated back in 2020. When that comes due, you've got the money to write that check. And so is that what you're talking about when it comes to a big spend? And that's the way that would work, because it just sits in the income account until you get ready to write the check. Is that how you perceive this is going to work?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, that's exactly how I perceive it's going to work. And that's what we were trying to ensure with the amendment, that the money that's in the income account stays in the income account. That's exactly why I proposed that amendment. It's a cash flow question. It's not an investment question. And that's so from an operator point of view, operating a fund and operating a program, we just need to be sure that it's there. But yes, it would sit in the income account. And then now with the amendment that was the change in the amendment, all of the interest or all of the earnings would spin back into the corpus, the trust account. I think it's very smooth. I think it addresses the issue that we had. And again, we're very comfortable with that.
Okay, so if I may, Mr. Chairman, a follow-up for Patrick.
Go ahead.
So Patrick, with that explanation, that really doesn't change the asset allocation, does it? From a standpoint to being a little more liquid or not? Because they're just carrying forward and aggregating whatever those obligations are in the income account, not necessarily putting further obligations on the corpus to generate liquidity. So does that then address that issue of the loss of the 0.5 basis points, that we would go back to that higher asset allocation under that scenario?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, no, that would be ideal to have that cash there, because if you look at any portfolio, you would say, okay, you want to have, approximately 5 in this environment. I would say closer to 10% in cash. We're raising cash right now. So having cash in this fund is absolutely the way to do it. As far as that allocation, as I said, we're indifferent. We've just said, as Director Budd just mentioned, he's not really sure on the timing, things like that. We're indifferent. We don't care. Whatever everyone decides, we can do whatever you want.
Follow up, Senator?
No, I think it gets back. I was a little confused with, to maintain a more liquid asset allocation portfolio in case there is a big spin, that would, the opportunity cost was that 50 basis points from an investment strategy, Patrick, that under the scenario that we just discussed, as long as, and because we can invade the corpus, that 4% spending policy is always going to be there. That right now we wouldn't have to forego that half or 50 basis points from an investment asset allocation strategy. I guess the direction I would say is shoot for the highest rate of return that we can get on that, instead of maintain something in case there's a big spend. I think we've addressed that through the spending policy, and then the way the income account would actually work.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. Yeah, you're spot on that, and it again, similar to Representative Storer, what she said. When she said, "Oh, as long as you're able to get that spend," and that's all we're referring to. So, for instance, like the institutions that got into trouble during the Great Financial Crisis, they had up to 70% of their assets in illiquid assets. That's a classic example of what happened to Columbia. Boom, you're down 58%. All of a sudden now that kind of 30% is now at 15%. And that's the 15% that you're spending for the monies that you need to run your operations. It just, from an asset allocation point, so you still have to have liquidity concerns no matter what, the way you're going through. But absolutely, we would never put 70% in illiquids. So, that's not an issue. But still, that's the problem that arises when you have a big drawdown, 50% plus in public equities, which you've had, 3, 4 in the last 20, 30 years times. And then the illiquids take such a larger percentage of your overall allocation that you get a mismatch.
Follow up, Senator?
No, I think that was a great explanation. I'm tracking now.
Director Bud, you have your hand up.
I did, and I just wanted to point out that what Patrick said is exactly where the question that we had originally came from. It was, if you have a situation and you have a spending allowance, and then you have things go wrong and there's no liquidity, can you actually tap the money that would be used for your program? And I think he answered it exactly the way that we interpreted it. So again, a high level of comfort at this point. We're going back to early days for early drafts of this bill. So I think we're in good shape here.
Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Another question for Patrick. I think all of that made perfect sense. Maybe the question is, when we take funds from the trust fund into the 4% into the income account, what form are those in? Are we keeping them in the same investments? Are we cashing them out? Is it out of cash, or I'm just curious how you're thinking about that. And then also then how is the income account earnings? What are those earnings likely to be?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer. So first line of distributions would be our normal distribution: interest income, dividends, realized capital gains. That is the first wave of allocations. If that does not meet the 4%, then you start going in pari passu across all of your liquids and reducing that exposure to fulfill that 4%. And that's where, in that analogy of Columbia, markets down, they only had 15%. You have a couple years of spend, you're out of money. You have to liquidate illiquids. So we just go through, but that's the instance of if you had many, many years of sub returns, you're liquidating the most liquid assets, your fixed income, your public equities, international equities, all of those things that are the liquid, and it gets down to a very, very low percent of your total assets. But that's the order of return. To your second question, so that cash return, the cash account would still be housed in the state agency pool, I believe. Katie, is that correct?
Patrick, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, this is Dawn. Patrick, Katie had to jump to another meeting, but yes, that is correct. So
thank you, Dawn. So Representative Storer, so right now, because there is no offsetting account. You don't have a reserve accounts for these cash accounts. We moved into what was called that ladder strategy, so we would never have a realized loss. We cannot have a realized loss in the state agency pool. So all we do is we roll treasuries. We have a ladder, a 1, 2, 3, 4 year ladder. And when we're at zero rates, it was really problematic. But right now, the yield to maturity on the state agency pool is 4.65. So we know we are going to get, at this date, we are going to get 4.65 when those bonds, those notes mature. T-bills and notes, we don't go into bonds. The current yield is the issue that you have, is because many of these securities, you know, we bought when it was zero interest rate policy, so they might be a 0.5% coupon,
Right.
that only yields 50 basis points, but the price of the note is at 90. So part of that yield to maturity calculation is your dividend yield income plus the accretion to par. So that 90 to 100 that we know we're going to get is the other yield to maturity. But those are the two. So current yield is about 265, and the yield to maturity is about 4.7, 4.8%.
Follow up, Representative?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one other question. If it has to do with one of the proposed amendments, the idea of taking those investment earnings from the income account and putting them back into the trust fund account, does that cause accounting problems for us to not be able to clearly see what the real earnings have been for the investments, the investment portfolio for that trust fund? In other words, are we adding more money in if we do it that way? That would create, a higher average investment return.
Patrick?
Mr. Chairman, I'll leave this to Dawn.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, I don't know if I exactly understand the earnings. The earnings are equally attributable, or not equally, but they are attributable to the account in which pool they earned the money. So earnings for the trust fund go to the trust fund, earnings for the income account go to the income account. And that's the benefit of having those two separate funds. That's why that makes it just so much cleaner, because then you can see, it's very transparent where the money is going.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Yes, Representative Storer, Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer. We do not, in the total return calculations that we provide, we do not take and combine those two issues. It would be very, very, very easy to take a 4.65% return and a 6.5% return. You have, 93% of your assets here, you have 7% here at this return. That calculation could be done in 10 seconds. And any entity, if they ever needed any help, we could calculate that for them and tell them what the total return on an annual basis would be.
Follow up, Representative?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Hicks, your hand is up.
No, I'll pass. I got a question that's probably far beyond. We need to let this thing run the way it is. I guess real quick, and this would be to Bob. Just historically, I know the trust fund board has been very frugal and very good trustees of those funds, but under a scenario where we got into let's say a severe recession, would you ever anticipate a time when the board's looking at that and say, look, if we take our 4% spend this year, we're going to be dipping into the corpus of the trust. So we're going to take 3% instead of 4%. That's what the actual yield is. I know you guys have kind of done that already in the past, not necessarily looking at the investment returns, but just looking at the overall income coming into the account. But is that some flexibility that you think the board would like to have? And I don't know that we want to get into how that would work. I'm just curious, Bob, if that's something you guys had considered.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I think you pretty well described the way we've operated since we started. And as I think I mentioned in one of the previous meetings, we in essence created a reserve account by the board every year, looking at what we anticipated and consulting with the treasurer's office and and saying, what do we think we're going to be earning? So, yes, I think the board absolutely at our annual meeting, when we talk about this, we look at what earnings look like. We would probably be in a position, we're certainly not interested in spending down the corpus, which was the genesis of a lot of the questions early on with this bill. So the board every year does that. And as I said, this year they spent over, but that's because last year their earnings were higher. And they had the ability to do it. There was demand for good projects, so they did it. But we look at that every 6 months, actually. We sit down and go through where we are financially and whether we should take a haircut ourselves or whether we should allocate more funding. I think it's worked very well, and I don't anticipate we would change the way we operate on a day-to-day basis.
Follow up, Senator?
Well, my thoughts would be to give the boards the flexibility to, and this becomes a question for the treasurer's office. The difficulty is it manageable? And your consultation with the board say, here's your 4%. Well, what if you went to the board and said, look, it's likely going to have to dip into the corpus this year. What do you want us to do? You want the 4%? Is that difficult for the treasurer's office? Or could the board come back and say, we really don't want to dip into the corpus. Can you just disperse 3.5% or 3%? Is that a possibility, Dawn?
Mr. Chairman, and I'll need Ian to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it is a possibility. The spending policy is the spending policy, and it says we shall transfer.
But what I'm asking you is if we say the board may elect to take less than the spending policy, does that create problems for the treasurer's office?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think so. I mean, we would just have we would just require the some documentation, that it sounds similar to the language that you added for the bifurcated amounts from, say, for the Game and Fish Fund. Some of it's in SAP and some of it's in Pool A, and that's determined by a vote of the commission. And so we just have minutes from the commission that says that. It seems to me that it could be similar to that if flexible language was added to the bill.
Mr. Chairman.
Who is that Senator Dick?
No, that's me, Director Budd.
Director Budd.
I want to clarify, the board already has the authority to put money back. I mean, we can accomplish this right now. It might be more confusing for the board to have to go to the treasurer and say, give us 3.5 or give us 2 3/4 than it would be to look at it and say, we're going to take our 4, but at the end of the year, we're going to recommend that we put money back into the corpus. We did that this year with the Appropriations Committee. We did that last year with the Appropriations Committee, and that money went back into the corpus. So I think rather than try to fine tune that now and figure how to do it, that the authority is there, and we will continue to do that pursuant to the question previously asked. The board looks at this, and I think we've got the capability to do it.
Senator Hicks?
I think that makes sense right now. I think by adding that language, potential amendment, it again, get back to Senator Guru's thing. Let's just keep this as simple as possible at this point in time and let it run for a couple of years. It just don't. And obviously they have a mechanism to do that. It's kind of taking money out of one pocket and putting back into the other, but it works now. So I'm inclined not to do anything just on that issue, and we'll see how it works over the next few years.
Thank you. Director Budd, I have a question for you on the amendments. Are we, in terms of your recommendations, are we down to one amendment adding leaving the income account as it exists June 30, that amendment? Is that the only one that you're thinking we should consider today?
I believe that's correct. And I'd have to defer to Mr. Shaw, but I think that's the only one. The other one that was in there, I actually would tell you not to do it after Deputy Treasurer Williams' comments. I'm totally comfortable with that one being gone. So yeah, the one that recognizes the existing funds is the only one I have.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, this is Ian.
Yes, Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one other thing. We also have the amendment that actually would delete the language about the income account accepting real title to property. I think that's that second amendment on on the page there also the committee should likely consider.
Ian, my notes on that say that basically that that the parties had agreed that this one could possibly not necessary and could possibly do more harm than good. Was that the input from Director Butt? Do you want to weigh in on that one?
Mr. Chairman, if I might clarify, that's exactly right. And that's why we would need to delete the language because the language likely does more harm than good. And so we would delete the language to get rid of it.
Oh, I see. So we actually need that one to clean it up. Director Butt, do you want to weigh in?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think we're just in violent agreement. I'm completely, we need that to go away. It confounds other things that are in our statute. So,
got it.
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, anyone else? Any other testimony? Karen, is there anyone else that wants to testify that you're aware of?
Mr. Chairman, Sarah Sheen has her hand up.
Sarah Sheen, welcome aboard. Introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sarah Sheen, I'm the Deputy Director for Cultural Resources Division. The Cultural Trust Fund lives in our division. And before you work this bill, I think I would just say we're on the same page largely with, or pretty much all the way through with Director Butt and his comments on how these amendments would impact our trust fund as well. I do want to say thank you to, we've been working through with Director Glenn and our board, working through all these issues and gotten a lot of advice from the Treasurer's Office on how this would impact us. And it's been a tremendous amount of help. Just want to throw out that the plan to have an aggregate we're all in favor of that. That would do nothing but good for our trust fund, I think. And overall, I think this really is some positive change for us. It will give us a little more reliability in terms of the amount of interest earnings that we'll have to grant out, or the amount of money we'll have to grant out every year. And then I think that just it gives us a lot of ability to plan moving forward every year for how we grant out money and what we can tell our grant recipients, what the possibility of what might be available to them. That's been a big issue for us too. So with that, I think I know you're getting close to the end time. I want to give you time to work the bill. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. But overall, I think we're moving in a positive direction.
Any questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. Karen, anyone else?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have anyone else's hands raised.
Okay, I think we'll close testimony. Committee, what's your pleasure on this bill?
Move the bill.
Second.
Moved by Senator Drew, seconded by Representative Walters.
Mr. Chairman.
Let's work the bill. Whose hand up? Oh, Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would go to page 11.
Yes, sir.
Since our lines are off slightly, I would move to amend somewhere in the neighborhood of lines 5 through 8 on page 11 to add the language in the account on June 30th, 2024. So the income account shall consist of those funds in the account on June 30th, 2024, funds credited to the account, etc.
Second.
Seconded by Senator Hicks. Any discussion? All in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That amendment passes. Any more amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on down the page, still on page 11. Again, the lines may not be completely accurate, but in the area of lines 11 and 12, I would move to delete the language, the income account shall not accept title to any interest in real property.
Second.
Seconded by Senator Hicks. Any discussion, committee? All those in favor say aye.
I,
Aye.
Opposed? And then pass. Any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to page 15. If I can find it. Excuse me, it's page 16. Romanet I, lines 15 through 19-ish. On mine, on the PDF version, it shows on line 17. At the end of the line, it says unless. I would move to delete unless and insert when.
Second.
That was seconded by Senator Drew. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
I,
All opposed? That amendment passes. Any further amendments? Okay, we're
Call
back
for-
on- Oh,
Call for the
Senator
question.
Hicks. Senator
Mr.
Hicks,
Chairman.
question, Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We need to go back to page 11, lines 18 through 20, and add some language there.
Oh, go ahead, Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe we need to add some language, lines 18 through 20, so that it says, unless the disposition of the earnings is otherwise directed by the appropriation, contribution, grant, gift, request, or donation from which the earnings are derived. Just making it a little more clear.
second.
Could you, re-
But we may, Mr. Chairman, I think we'd like to have a little discussion on that now, as this may cause accounting issues.
Right. Okay,
could you repeat the page number and the line where this proposed amendment's going?
yeah, it's on page 11. It's down around, it's on my copy, it's on line 18. And it's the right after the word section before the period. All of this on the amendment sheet at the bottom, all of the dark underlined section down there is what's added there. And so we need to discuss that as a committee as to whether we want that language to be included or not.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I don't-
Senator Hicks.
I don't know that we need that language in the bill. I think it's already covered under the statutory authority, but unless I heard wrong from those who testified on the bill, we really don't need that language anymore. That's my recollection of the testimony.
Anyone else? Or,
Mr. Chairman, can I make a quick comment about that?
yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, just to make super clear so everyone's on the same page, this is the third amendment on those proposed amendments that I had outlined. And I think Senator Hicks is correct that the testimony so far has been that that may not be necessary. Just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page.
Don, I have a question. Don Williams, I have a question for you on this. I just want to make sure my notes in terms of your testimony is up to speed, but I had an original note here that I think might have come out of an email that this really can't work, or it's nearly impossible. What do you think about this amendment?
Mr. Chairman, we don't like it, frankly. It complicates things unnecessarily, in our opinion. And as Director Budd testified, they are able to accomplish this through current practice now. So it just doesn't, in our opinion, it doesn't seem necessary.
Okay, thank you. Representative Walters, did you move that or were you just asking a question about it?
Believe I was just asking a question before making the motion.
Okay, does anybody want to move this amendment? No. Okay, any other amendments? Okay, we have a question on the floor on the
Mr.
bill
Chairman?
itself.
I might bring us, if you'll indulge me a second, on the
Yes.
amendment that we adopted on page 16.
Yes,
We changed that language from, we struck the word unless and added the word when. I might, so I think that we need then an additional amendment at the very last three words of that same paragraph to consider. It would then say, if the bequest or donation so provides, and then strike the word otherwise. So it would say, when the appropriation, contribution, grant, gift, transfer, bequest, or donation so provides.
So
Okay.
moved.
moved by Senator Hicks. Seconded by Senator Drew. All those in favor say aye. All those
Aye.
opposed?
Aye.
I didn't even give you a chance to say aye. I just assumed. Okay, that one passed. All right, we're back to the question called by Senator Hicks. So let's take a roll call, Karen.
Yes, sir. On 24 LSO 0267 as amended, Senator Driscoll,
Aye.
Senator Furphy,
Aye.
Senator Guru,
Aye.
Senator Hicks,
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz,
Aye.
Representative Harshman excused. Representative Knapp, I understand you'll do a visual vote. I'll take that as an aye. Representative Larson left a proxy vote of aye. Representative Storer,
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Vice Chairman Nethercott excused. Chairman Obermueller,
Aye.
10 aye, 2 excused.
All right, that concludes our meeting. Thank you very much, committee and all.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Ian.
Mr. Chairman, we had talked briefly, I don't know if you wanted to announce the potential or interim committee dates that are kind of tentatively scheduled for next interim.
Take it away, Ian. Ian, thanks. Thanks for the reminder.
Sure. We have tentatively scheduled the following dates for next year's interim already to get ahead of the other committees. Those would be May 29th and 30th in Casper. Just a reminder, and if anyone's on the phone still, they can correct us, but I believe the Treasurers Conference is going to be August 25th through the 27th. That's very tentative because that's the Treasurer's office, but I just wanted to mention it, so you might loosely put it in your calendars. The next Cap Fin meeting would be September 5th.
Could you repeat the Treasurers Conference?
Sure,
date?
Treasurers Conference, August 25th through 27th. And then the location, the next Cap Fin meeting would be September 5 and 6, location to be determined. And then the final Cap Fin meeting on October 29th and 30th, likely in Cheyenne.
Ian, could you repeat the previous one?
Sure will, and I'll just do all of them for you. So May 29, 30th in Casper. The Treasurers Conference on August 25th through 27th. September 5 and 6 for a Cap Fin meeting, location to be determined. And then October 29 and 30th in Cheyenne.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator Hicks.
just one other point of business. If you were so inclined, the Senate would be more than happy to sponsor this legislation. Make it a-
I think, thank you for that positive response to that idea because I think that's very good. Started on the Senate side.
Mr. Chairman, we can do that.
All right, anything else? Thank you very much, LSO staff. Great job. Thank you, committee, for participating, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.